This is our first look at the skeletal system. So, the functions of the skeletal system are quite a few actually. The first one is that bones, which make up your skeleton, help to support and protect the other portions of the body. So they provide shape so that the body is not just a big pile of mush. They help to hold the weight of the body. Otherwise, your muscles would be too heavy to be upright. And they also help to protect softer organs from injury or damage. So, for example, here behind the rib cage, we've got the heart and the lungs and some other organs are kind of partially covered by the rib cage, but those bones help to protect. A second function is to allow the body for movement. If we didn't have bones attached to our muscles, the muscles wouldn't be able to move us around. So the bones act as a connection point or lever for the movement of the body and allow us to create a whole bunch of different kinds of motions and movements. The first kind of detail about this movement is that we need long bones to act as a rigid support system. So you can see in this picture of the arm up here, there are two muscles attached to that one long bone of the arm. The joints, or places where multiple bones connect, are called the fulcrum. That means that it allows for a change in the angle of the movement. There has to be some kind of resistance, which is usually the weight of whatever is being moved. So in this case, that would be the weight of the hand because it's being moved up toward the shoulder and potentially back down. And then there is a need for muscles and tendons to provide the force of that movement. So in this case, we have two muscles involved. We've got the bicep on the front side of the arm and the tricep on the back side of the arm. What's interesting about the way that muscles work in the body is whenever one muscle, so this one, for example, the bicep, when the bicep contracts, the tricep on the backside must relax. And just in reverse, whenever the tricep contracts, the bicep must relax. So if the tricep contracted, the hand would drop back down. The third function, which many people don't know about bones, is that they are responsible for the creation of new blood cells. The making of new blood cells is a process called hematopoiesis, and it basically means to make blood. When we are in the fetal stage, before we're actually born, there is a yolk sac early on, and then our liver and our spleens take over this job. But once a person is born, the blood cells become made and produced in the inside of long bones. So we have this cavity right here called the medullary cavity. I'm going to just say MC, the medullary cavity is right there. That is where red bone and yellow, or pardon me, not red bone, red marrow and yellow marrow are stored. The red marrow is the only one that makes new blood cells. So red marrow makes red blood cells, it makes white blood cells, and it makes platelets. Whereas yellow marrow only is responsible for the storing of fat. It doesn't have anything to do with blood cells. When we are little, we need lots and lots of blood cells being produced because we're growing significantly, right? So when you're born, let's say you're roughly this size, and by adulthood, you're roughly this size. It takes a lot of blood in order to help the cells grow and get bigger and reproduce. So we need lots and lots of blood cell production. So when we're little, we have primarily red marrow. As we get bigger, as we get into maturity at the end of puberty, then we have a lot more yellow marrow being created because we don't need blood as frequently or as necessarily as we did when we were little. And so there's more yellow marrow in adults. So let's make this guy yellow. There we go. Than there is in kids. Kids have a lot more red marrow. But the body is capable of switching those ratios when it needs to. Another function of the skeletal system is to store inorganic salts. So what that means is we have different minerals that are really important for both bone health and for nerve health and for muscle health in the body. And because your bones have this hollow space in them and have openings throughout the solid parts of the bone, it makes it an ideal place to store things. And so some of the nutrients that are stored, we have calcium stored in the bones itself. That calcium is very important for muscle action, nerve action, hormone production, all kinds of things. We also have sodium, potassium, magnesium, which are all metals, and then some negative ions like carbonate and some others. The body's constantly monitoring the level of calcium that's in the blood. If your blood gets low in calcium, then specialized bone cells called osteoclasts will begin to break down some of the solid part of the bone, which releases calcium into the blood supply. Okay, so let's talk about what different kinds of bones you have in the body. There are quite a few. So we generally group them by their general shape. So we have, as adults, about 206 bones total in the body. When we're born, we have more like 275 as babies. And bones begin to kind of join together throughout our lives. So we classify them based on their general size and shape. The first is long bones, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can see that right here. That would be like the bones of the upper and lower arms, the upper and lower legs. Then we have short bones, which are found in places where there's a big collection of bones all in the same place, and they tend to be more kind of square or cube-like. So really, I don't know why they don't call them square bones, but they don't. They call them short bones. So here's an example, and that would be in places like the wrist and the ankle. Then we have flat bones, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. Here's an example. So that's one of the bones of the skull. The sternum right here is also an example of a flat bone. Then we have irregular bones. Again, pretty straightforward. It's a shape that's pretty odd. So some irregular bones would be all the bones of the spinal cord, or spinal column, pardon me, which are called vertebrae. And then we have sesamoid bones, which tend to be sort of rounded, and they are kind of floating in space. Not literally floating, but they're surrounded by tendons. And so there aren't very many examples of sesamoid bones in the body. Generally, we just refer to the patella or kneecap. So we're going to look at the structure of the long bone because it is so important in the storage of all these different things, and it's really important in your general overall height and how you grow and develop. So both ends of the long bone are called the epiphysis. So you can see like this is an example of a femur, which is the upper leg bone. So you have an epiphysis, you have an end here, and you have an end here. So both of those are covered by a structure called cartilage, which is smooth and slippery, and it helps to protect those ends because at this end you would have a hip, and at this end you would have a knee. So there's lots of action happening there. There's lots of movement of bones near one another. The cartilage helps to protect those bones from rubbing on each other. The center portion of the long bone is called the diaphysis, so that tends to be the skinnier portion. And then we have, if you imagine that this bone has been kind of cut in half and we're looking now at the inside of it, the top part shows the inside. The entire bone is wrapped, everywhere that there's not cartilage, it is wrapped in a structure called the periosteum. So it's like a little very, very tight wrapper along there that connects to soft tissue like ligaments, tendons, the cartilage at the ends. Inside of that wrapper is a very, very thick, solid layer of bone called the compact bone, which has almost no space. And then at the ends, we have this area called the spongy bone, which looks just like what you would think a sponge would look like. It has lots of holes, and it's not very dense, and it allows for a lot of volume at the ends without a lot of weight. So looking at the inside of the bones, continuing with that, up where the spongy bone, so remember I told you this is the spongy bone, at each kind of end of the bone, we have these two solid portions called the epiphyseal plate. This is also known in normal English as the growth plate. You might have heard that term before. And what that does is it helps to provide a little bit more strength at the ends because of that spongy bone being really hollow. But it also is really important in the growth of the long bones over time. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Then we have all the way at the very, very center, we talked about this a little bit before with blood cell formation. We have the hollow medullary cavity, which is full of marrow, and it is lined by a smooth set of bone cells called the endosteum. Okay, so when we are developing our bones to begin with, they start out made of cartilage, a special kind of cartilage called hyaline cartilage, which doesn't have a whole lot of flexibility. So our bones start as cartilage when we're in the womb, and then that cartilage begins to break down, starting usually in the very center of the bone. The cartilage breaks down and becomes, then we get bone cells coming in that form spongy bone. So it's a little bit tougher than cartilage. And we get the periosteum around the outside, so it protects it and provides a little strength. And then new bone cells come in and we form compact bone, which provides the structure of the overall bone. So if you can imagine here, let's say we've got a cartilage femur. That's a terrible picture of a femur, but it's going to be all right. So say this is all cartilage. So then the spongy bone cells come in and start to replace the cartilage with spongy bone, also kind of here along the center. Then the periosteum forms. So now we've got a good shell on here. And then the compact bone comes and it forms the solid parts of this bone and fills in that space. As you are growing later in life, all of that growth happens down here at the ends. So when you are a little kid, let's say 4 or 5, you already have solid bones, but you need to get taller. These bones need to lengthen. So what happens is here at the epiphyseal plates, new bone is made here and made and made and made. And eventually what happens is this bone gets longer and longer. This end moves out and we get more and more of a middle portion of bone. So eventually your epiphyseal plate stops creating new bone because you're as tall as you're going to be. And so then we get these this deposit of permanent cells. So there are a couple of different kinds of permanent bone cells. The first one is called an osteoclast. Osteoclasts are responsible for destroying bone cells. That sounds really dramatic, but that's just when bone cells get old and they need to be replaced. The osteoclasts break them down so that new bone cells can be created. The cells that create the new bones are called osteoblasts. So the way I remember that is osteoblasts build B. So the osteoblasts bring in new bone tissue to replace old and damaged tissue. Once all those cells are solid and formed, then the body stops growing. Once we have finished growing, what we really need to focus on is making sure that we keep the bones healthy so that they can do all of the functions that we need them to do. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts are working your whole life. There's always bone cells that need to be replaced because they're old or damaged, and there's always new bone being made. As we get older, that slows down significantly. So the body is breaking down bone much faster than it's rebuilding bone, which is why old people break bones a lot easier, which is why old people are shorter as they age. They start to lose actual bone tissue. All of this is managed by hormones. like human growth hormone, for example, that tells your body when to grow and when to stop. And they also help to monitor calcium levels to make sure that we have the amount of calcium we need. It's important to have vitamin D, which helps the body to absorb calcium from your food. If we didn't have enough calcium in the bones, then your bones start to get soft, they get deformed, which is why people who are malnourished, who are underfed, their body needs calcium, their blood needs calcium for muscles and for nerves. So it's taking that calcium all the time from the bones, and the bones get softer and softer and more deformed with time. Obviously, your bones also change as you grow and change during puberty, which are just different processes in your lifespan. The more you exercise, the better it is for the body in general, but it also helps strengthen your bones in particular. Okay, so that is it for our first look at the skeletal system. Here are your summary questions. Please make sure to answer them in the summary part of your notes and bring in your own 2 or 3 questions for discussion. Thank you.